Greetings, I'm Howard Gardner, and I'm speaking to you from Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it's my pleasure to be able to speak with you at this conference, which is honoring Montessori education, the first 100 years. And my topic today is theory and practice in early childhood education. In every area of education, from schools for infants to the university, there's a tension between a concentration on theory as contrasted with a focus on practice. Anybody with a long-term interest in education will have some ideas about the nature of children and youth, development, the needs and demands of the surrounding society. And anybody with a long-term interest in education will have particular rules and practices which they would like to see implemented. Thinkers from Plato to Rousseau as philosophers, and Thomas Jefferson and Mao Zedong as political leaders had little hesitation in recommending a favorite course of education for all young individuals. And any reflective teacher or head of school, as well as most parents, will favor certain materials and practice over others, and impressed these teachers or parents are likely to reveal an implicit or even an explicit theory of human nature and of child development. As we survey the last century or so in early childhood education, we see a similar division of labor. Major psychological thinkers like Jean Piaget, Lev Vygotsky, Jerome Bruner, and B.F. Skinner, as well as philosophers like John Dewey and Jürgen Habermas, put forth conceptions of human development and growth. And on the basis of these conceptions, they have proposed specific educational interventions. Any student of education and psychology will be able to match the names I've just given you with, respectively, action upon objects, Piaget, the zone of proximal development, Vygotsky, going beyond the information given, Bruner, preparation for dialogue and debate, Habermas. And while they may be less well known among scholars, educators like Caleb Gattegno with his geoboards and Cuisenaire rods, or Samuel Orton and Dorothy Gillingham with their phonograms, have had significant impact on how educators think respectively about mathematics education and about the teaching of reading to dyslexic children. As it happens, two educational giants of the 20th century, both Italians, had notable success in bridging the often considerable gap between theory and practice. I have in mind Loris Malaguzzi, the educational genius whose ideas inspired and created the Reggio Emilia approach to early childhood education, and of course Maria Montessori, the educational genius who inspired and created what is now universally known as Montessori education. It's notable that both of these educators came from a small or middle-sized European country rather than far larger countries like the United States or Russia or China or India. Moreover, both of these giants achieved their impact against enormous odds. Maria Montessori, one of the first women to become a physician in Italy, was continuously struggling against a male-dominated profession in a politically unstable environment. And Loris Malaguzzi, trained as a journalist, began his educational work in a bombed-out area of post-World War II northern Italy, where women, mothers in particular, were struggling to survive and to raise their children. And like Montessori, Malaguzzi worked at a time when politics in Italy were turbulent. While I was not present as they developed their ideas and practices, I see both of these individuals, both Malaguzzi and Montessori, as sensitive theorists and as sensible practitioners. They were well-educated, widely read, and they were able to build on important educational concepts and practices from earlier eras. But at the same time, both educators were carrying out the necessary experimentation day in and day out, year in and year out. And helped by dedicated collaborators, they were creating materials, practices, and ambiances that were appropriate for the age groups with which they were working, and for the parents and teachers of that era. And again, it must be underscored, the often turbulent political conditions of their time. I think it's because their work is so well grounded in practice as well as in theory that today, in 2020, decades after their deaths, their names and their methods dominate early childhood education all over the world. If you go to China or India, Australia or Brazil, the names Dewey or Vygotsky may have little resonance. But if you say Montessori or Reggio Emilia, those knowledgeable about childhood education will immediately know what you have in mind, which is not to say, alas, that their ideas and practices are necessarily well understood or properly realized. It's easier to say Montessori or Reggio than to have assimilated and be able to put ideas and practices into action. Let me say a word about my own connection to these inspiring lines of work. I'm basically a scholar, a thinker, a developer of ideas, and not an educational practitioner. In fact, when I was studying for my doctorate in the late 1960s, I decided to teach a class of 5 to 7-year-olds in Newton, Massachusetts, to see what it was like. I soon concluded I did not have the skills or the tenacity to work as a teacher with young children, though I did have some success in teaching the piano to somewhat older youths, and I've cherished being a parent to 4 children of my own, and now a grandparent to thus far 5 grandchildren, one of whom, Olivia, is attending the Montessori School in Hartford, Connecticut. In the 1970s, as a young developmental psychologist, I was carrying out research with 2 populations, brain-damaged adults on the one hand, and children involved in the arts on the other. This immersion in the worlds of very different populations led me to challenge the notion of intelligence as a single human capacity, one that could be adequately assessed by a single, easily administered intelligence or IQ test. And I put forth the well-known, though still controversial, theory of multiple intelligences. The theory that claims that human beings don't have a single computer in the mind-brain, as the IQ concept and the IQ test assume, not a single computer, but rather a set of relatively independent computational devices, which I've termed the multiple intelligences. In the wake of proposing MI theory, my colleague David Feldman and I decided it would be appropriate to see whether we could document the existence and growth of these putatively separate intelligences in young children. And so, working with gifted researchers Mara Krzyzewski, Julie Venz, Janet Stork, and Jackie Chen, we created an educational intervention and set of materials that we dubbed Project Spectrum. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, our research team implemented this intervention in Boston area schools, and eventually we published 3 volumes about Project Spectrum, which have been translated into several languages. As I reflect on our adventures with teaching and assessment in early childhood some decades ago, I now realize that our efforts were heavily dependent on the 2 educational geniuses to whom I earlier referred. We turned readily to materials that had been developed by Maria Montessori, such as blocks, which we used to assess spatial and kinesthetic intelligences, and the bells, which we used to assess musical intelligence. And as we observed and occasionally intervened in classrooms, we were cognizant of the 100 languages of children described by Loris Malaguzzi, as well as the open, experimental, exploratory, and nurturant milieus characteristic of Montessori, Reggio Emilia, and progressive education more broadly. We strove to balance the use of carefully crafted materials, which are essential for any measurement, with a milieu, an environment that allowed children to explore freely the sensory, motor, and problem-solving potentials of these materials, and that was essential if we wanted to survey the spectrum of intelligences, hence Project Spectrum. This kind of balance, a well-structured environment, along with a trust in the capacities of children to learn from their own activities as well as from their interactions with their peers, has characterized the approach of thoughtful educators all over the world across the last century. Speaking of the last century, it's apt to raise this question. If Montessori and Malaguzzi were returned to Italy today, or indeed to any country, and to observe the radically different technological, cultural, social, political, and work worlds of 2020 as compared to 1920 or to 1970, how would they proceed? What would Malaguzzi and what would Montessori do? What changes would they make? I don't know the answer to this question, which is, of course, counterfactual. We cannot put ourselves into the minds of educational geniuses and pioneers who've been dead, respectively, for over 70 years or over 25 years. But I'm willing to wager that their basic ideas about children, about development, about 100 languages, about the absorbent mind, as well as the practices which they developed, would endure. After all, the approaches that they developed can be observed today in the classrooms of the best Reggio and Montessori teachers, whether they're in Italy, Iceland, India, or Indiana. Thank you for your kind attention. I wish you all the best for a truly memorable conference.